Good evening. How many are familiar with the song Where Joy and Sorrow Meet? Raise your hand. Have you heard that one? Okay. It's a worship song, praise and harmony. They have it. I'm sure it came from another source at some point. It's not super new. I think it's probably about 10 years old by now. It's one of the most beautiful songs I feel like I've ever heard. I've thought that for years, and hopefully it'll be one sometime down the line that we can learn on our singing emphasis nights. So the basis of the song is this. It's really looking back at the Lord and what was accomplished, and the fact that, we're so excited about everything that He did for us, but how much we're filled with sorrow every time we think about how much He did have to endure for us. And I just think it would be a tremendous Lord's Supper song, but I think it would also be a great invitation song. Anyway, I had that on my mind the last couple of days, where we are in 2 Samuel 19, if you'd like to turn there. And I think it is really indicative of David's life and the circumstances that he's facing right now. Of course, our lesson is not about Jesus tonight or even how we feel about what Jesus did for us, but that does come to my mind because David is experiencing so much joy and so much sorrow, and I would say really so much more sorrow at this point. But it's really mixed in this time in Israel. So why would David maybe have a little bit of joy in his heart by 2 Samuel 19? What's just occurred in the previous chapter? Okay, and that's the not so good part, right? So his heart is filled with sorrow because his son has passed from the scene. Okay, why does he maybe have deep down tucked away some joy, and probably should have a little bit more than what he possesses at the moment? What's also just happened in chapter 18? Because of the fact that his son is dead, okay, he's been reinstated. The kingdom has been restored. Very good, Marty. And so in Israel, there's certainly a lot of joy. And David, I think probably deep down, there's probably some joy, but it's not showing very well. There's so much sorrow that has filled his heart. So we're going to begin in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 19. We have a pretty lengthy chapter, but we'll do our best to get through it, or at least most of it. Verse 1, and Joab, be reminded, is David's commander of the armed forces. Joab was told, behold, the king is weeping, and he is mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. All right, I want you to try to picture this for just a moment, and it kind of reminded me of the scene. Obviously, I wasn't around to see it then. But it reminds me of the scene of the pictures that you see after World War II. When, the war is over, the treaty's been signed, and the troops are coming back home. There's all the parades going down through the street. That's normally what happens whenever a nation wins the war. And that's what's happened here. The real nation of Israel has won the war. The true king is going to be able to take over his throne once again. And so the people are excited and they want to celebrate. But then they find out their king is upset. So the day of joy turns into mourning for the people because of what they hear about their king. Now, why do you think the people have this reaction? That they hear David's sorrowful, so they're all jubilant, and all of a sudden their sorrow turns to joy. Why would they do that? Okay, so a lot of the people are excited. We got the knucklehead out of the way. That could be one reason. Very good, Gene. Initially, they're so excited about that, but also there was some love for Absalom, right? But they're celebrating, and their joy is turned to mourning. There are two things that come to mind here for me. It could be that they might fear for their lives. In an authoritarian style of government, you don't defy the king, and you often want to try to follow the mood of the king, because it could mean you'd be punished if you don't, and it may even mean your life. I'd like to think more of the people than that, though. How do the people look at David? They adore the king. Let's not forget about. There you go. Let's not forget about the ruler that we adore. I think some of it is down that road. Remember, they basically told them before they go out to battle, no, you stay behind. We'd rather have 10,000 of us die than you be the only one. They love their ruler still. And so I think they have so much respect for him. Verse 3, this is the New King James Version. And the people stole back into the city that day. That's strange terminology, isn't it? You don't hear that very often. They stole back. What does that mean? To steal, but not like to take things that don't belong to you. This is a secondary definition. What is it? Good. Very quietly, maybe as well, even kind of, under the radar. If you're an animal, you might be dragging your tail behind you, right? So, they're not all chipper as they come into town. So very solemnly they come back home. Very good, Paul. Quite quietly, they come back home. They stole back into the city that day. Now remember what you're accustomed to seeing after your people win the war. And again, I go back in my mind. I think it's one of the coolest things in for sure American history, if not all of history. And the parades and all the music and people throwing their hats up in the air and all the confetti and how loud and exciting. The atmosphere is electric. But they all come back into town kind of like not trying to make it. It's very strange after the kingdom has just been saved. They stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. If you run away from the battlefield and you're a soldier, why do you try to kind of sneak out away from everybody? What happens if you get caught? You will be killed if that's the case, especially in this time, right? So you will be executed if you are found. And you're ashamed and you quietly try to sneak out because you know you've done something wrong and something that can and should cost you your life. So we're told that the people, and these are the people who have been out helping David and fighting, that they come back into the city as those who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. So what's the psychological status of these people? How do they feel about themselves, does it seem? They feel like runaway soldiers. In other words, they feel like what? Okay, good. Yeah, they feel like they've done something wrong here because the mood and the king is kind of giving that impression to them. These guys have gone out and risked their lives, and they've done it for this guy and for the kingdom. And now this guy is making them feel like they've done something wrong. Verse 4, but the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son, Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." I want you to consider with me the reaction of Joab in the next several verses. Of course, David's commander of the armed forces. Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "David, today you have disgraced all of your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and your daughters, the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines." And let's not forget what Absalom did with David's concubines out in the midst of all Israel on top of the roof, set up a tent so that everybody could know what was going on. He disrespected you, your throne, everyone in your family. He threatened your life and all the lives of your loved ones. And these people have gone out and saved your life and all of these people's. And he says, you've disgraced these men who have fought for you, and you've shown that you love your enemies and you hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us would have died, then it would have pleased you well. Do you think this is fair, what it is that Absalom states to David? Why or why not? You would have been just fine if all of us, or a good bunch of us, would have died, and your treasonous son would have survived, and your kingdom would still be at threat. You'd be happier than what you are right now. What do you think? You agree or disagree with his assessment? Yeah. And his life is preserved, his kingdom is preserved. Again, the lives of his family members are preserved, and it doesn't seem like he could be any more upset right here than what he is. I think it's probably a true assessment that he makes. Okay, so you let me know. Would you want to blame David right now in this circumstance? I see a yes, I hear a no. You could see a reason for it, couldn't you? And why could you, go ahead, Rebecca, you don't have to answer that, but why could you see a reason? Yeah. what parent could take joy in the occurrence, number one, and number two, even if things are bad, wrong, and the kid's, an absolute mess, wouldn't you want more opportunities to try to help them fix things? Right? Yeah, and so there's good reason a person could find fault with what David's doing, but at the same time, unless someone's really been in those shoes, how could you really even say and try to judge a person to be correct or incorrect? But there are arguments to be made. Joe? Could be. That'd make a lot of sense. Great point, Joe. 1 Thessalonians 4, right? There's sorrow even for Christians, but it's different, not as those without no hope. And when there's no hope in a situation, the grieving is completely different than the alternative. Good. All right, so hopefully we can all see both perspectives in the very least of, but at the same time, these people have risked all. They've proved themselves to be better family and stronger, and a great lesson we learn in the body of Christ, right? Our real family, when done correctly, resides right here, and not those who are flesh and blood. Well, so he really rakes him over the coals about this, and he says, hey, if the situation were reversed, we think you'd be more pleased about it, and that upsets us. Verse 7, now therefore arise and go out, and you need to address, speak to, and comfort your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night, and that will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now. I'd like to say that's a warning, but I think it might be a little more of a threat. We've learned, and we're going to see that even more, that these commanders of the army, they commanded tremendous prowess, and they had their own followings. And I think he might be saying, I'm going to strip this army from you that has protected you and put you back into power, and you're never going to see them again unless it's going to be warring against you. Anyway, whether a warning or a threat, it could be observed. Verse 8, then the king arose, and he sat in the gate. He listened to the advice, and undoubtedly very wise advice, of his commander. And they told all the people, saying, there's the king sitting in the gate. So all the people came before the king, for every one of Israel had fled to his tent. I can say, I hope nobody in this room can, but I can only try to imagine the grief that David is experiencing right now. That being said, when you become a leader of people, there are things that you sign up for that even are going to make you uncomfortable at times. And one of those is when you're a leader of people, you have to put a smile on your face when you're not smiling at times on the inside. And, you have to give enthusiasm when you just want to crawl into a corner at times. There are things that you have to do as a leader, even if you don't feel like it. And again, I'm not trying to judge David. I can't even begin to imagine what he's experiencing right now. But it doesn't change the fact that he's leader of the people, and he needs to go out and rally the troops. And it's good advice that Joab gives him. So that's exactly what he does. Verse 9. Now all the people were in a dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel. And that makes sense. Consider what just happened. It's a civil discord and uprising that's taken place. Not everyone's in agreement here. The tribes were in a dispute throughout all of the area of Israel, saying, the king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines. And now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, he's died in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king? There's an attempt here to unify, and people are just on different pages. So King David, the ultimate unifier that he is, he sent to Zadok and Abiathar, his liaisons during this conflict, the priests, saying, speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house? Since the words of all Israel have come to the king to his very house. You are my brethren, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king? Why isn't that you don't want to accept me? I'm not going to chase out after you. Let's bring all of this back together and enjoy the unison that we once had with one another. Verse 13, here's a great unity plea. David sends out word and say to Amasa, are you not my bone and flesh also? God do so to me and more also. If you are not commander of the army before me continually in place of Joab, I think this is two things. As I mentioned, this is a unifying tactic. But number two, in place of Joab, I think might also be a shot at the commander. He's always been there for David. He's been in place. And I should correct, he's always been in the position. I don't know if you could say, though, he's always been there for David. Why are some reasons that David might want to put this guy in place of Joab? Turn back to chapter 17. We're still in 2 Samuel. Let's read together from chapter 17, verse 25. Before we do that, before you look at it, does anybody remember who Amasa is? Captain? Yeah, there you go. Very good. Okay, but just to point out, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. 2 Samuel 17, verse 25. So during this coup, Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. It's way too much relation for my small brain. But I sorted through this, and I think I told you when we went through chapter 17. As best I can figure it out, I believe what's being said there is it's his first cousin, Joab's first cousin. Now, that's a long way of doing it, but that's the way I understand it. Check me out and see if you find something different. One thing's for sure, there's a relation, and it appears to be a pretty close relation between the two. But Absalom made a pointed effort to make sure he doesn't get Joab, but he wants this guy, Amasa, to be in charge instead. Okay, so going back to our text in chapter 19 and verse 13, the king has these words spoken to Amasa when he's trying to bring everybody back together. You're my bone, you're my flesh, we're related. God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of the army before me continually, meaning from this point and permanently, in place of the guy Joab. So maybe he's just trying to unite everybody. Okay, we'll take some of your leadership and some of mine and we'll splice them together. How does that sound to everybody? That's one thing. But the second one may be this. What kind of negative experiences has David had with Joab through the years, even though they've experienced everything through the kingship, ups and downs? Anybody remember going way back in the early part of 2 Samuel? Joab kills somebody. And his name is Abner. So that's Abner, 2 syllables, right? So he kills Abner, who is the commander of Saul back during the day. But also, when there are the competing kingdoms and there's actually some civil discord for 2 years and some actual conflict that occurs, that he becomes the commander of Ishbosheth's army, who you recall is one of Saul's sons. And that's, of course, before he switches over and he's killed. Okay, but whenever the unity happens and Abner is brought into the fold, Joab's upset about this because in battle, Abner killed Joab's brother. And in a time of peace, he pulls him to the side and, hey, let's talk over here by the well, and stabs him in the stomach and kills him right there on the spot. David was furious about it. He just made a pact with him of peace. And Abner had just brought all the tribes of Israel in unity together, and he just kills the guy in absolute cold blood. And David actually places a curse on him way back early in his reign. That's number one. Number two, what have we just experienced with Joab? He loves shedding blood. One of his favorite things to do. Now, did Absalom deserve it? Absolutely. We're not debating that, okay? But the issue is what, Andrea? That he killed him. And it's in war too, so that's not like just straight out murder. I believe you're right. Go ahead. Okay, but the king had told them, deal gently with my son. And yeah, he's no threat to anyone now. I mean, he could be again down the road. I'm not saying he deserves to live, okay? It's just by the king's decree. He's just hanging in midair by his 5 pounds of beautiful hair. I mean, just gently let the guy down and let him use his conditioner that night, and things will be fine. But he takes his javelin, actually 3 of them, right, and throws them into his heart. Boom, boom, boom. And he's probably, suffering, and then he orders the servants to finish the job, and they do. I'm sure David's probably heard about that by this point. And he, I think, is through with Joab. Right now, that could change, though, as we move on down the road. So Amasa is put into place instead of Joab, or is in the process of. So he swayed all the hearts of the men of Judah, just as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word to the king, return, you and all your servants. I mentioned the following that these commanders had. Abner, who's the commander of the armed forces, remember his standoff with Ishbosheth, the northern king, who he put in place for a time, and they have kind of a little bit of a falling out, a disagreement, and Abner pretty much gives him the what for, and he says, you really think you hold any power? I mean, it's kind of a chilling moment. You can just almost feel Ishbosheth, the king, just back down before him, and he says, I'm through with you, and your kingdom's done also. And he goes and he gets all the people behind him. He turns it all over to David and the other kingdom and brings those two together. So they have a lot of power. And this guy, Amasa, he's the same way among all the rebels. He unites, and David knows, he's seen this happen before. He brings Israel, or is at least in the process of bringing them all together once more. Verse 15, then the king returned and came to the Jordan. Pause, pop geography quiz. Where have we been hanging out for a while now? Good, good. Yeah, and excellent, Freddie, and good job, Marty. The forest of Ephraim. Okay, Joe and Paul had a great question a Wednesday night or two ago. They mentioned and astutely brought up that the tribe allotment of Ephraim is actually, if you go just straight up from my laser beam there, it was actually on the west side of the Jordan River. But you cross over, and this is on the east side. It's like, wait a minute, how did Ephraim get land on the east side? I looked into that. It's absolutely fascinating. The short of it is we don't have time right now. There is a lot to it, but it's really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. And it goes way back in the early days of the tribe allotment. But anyway, so the forest of Ephraim over on the east side, that's where the battle took place, and that is Mahanaim, or whatever you call it. I'm happy if you're happy. And so that's the place where the makeshift capital of the true king, unfortunately, had to be set up for some time, and that's where we've been. And I just point that out because we don't want to think because David's usually in Jerusalem, that's where they are right now. He's had to run away from Jerusalem. So the king returned, and he came to the Jordan, and he's approaching from the northeast, and he comes down southwest, comes to Gilgal, very significant Israelite history, just across the Jordan River and barely north of the Salt Sea, as you can tell on the map. He came to Gilgal, Judah did, to meet the king, to escort the king across the Jordan. And this is important because Judah is the territory that was in supreme rebellion against the king. They've been won over. They bring an escort to help bring him back across. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hurried and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. He's the first individual that we're told. Does anybody recall the background of Shimei? He's not very far back in 2 Samuel. Whenever David, in disgrace, has to leave his capital behind, and he and his men are on the way, this guy is a really mature fellow. He picks up, go ahead. Huh? Yeah, excellent. Good job. So, Lizzie, he was cursing him left and right, nasty things he was saying about him, maybe his mama and everybody else also. And he picks up dust and throws it in the air and picks up rocks and throws at the guys. And Abishai, David's right-hand man, one of the several, and this is the brother of Joab and Asahel, is this another A, what is it? Asahel, who runs like the gazelle, okay? He's the 4'3" guy in the 40. But he's the one that was killed. And then you have the other brother. And Abishai says, oh, king, let me just go lop his head off. It won't take very long. I'll get rid of this pesky mosquito over here. And he says, no, just leave him. You know, who is he? Leave him alone and consider my errors. And maybe what he's saying is even right about me and the curses. Maybe it's coming from God. Perhaps I deserve it for my errors. Well, Shimei is the first one to come and to meet the king. He has a whole different tune than what he had prior. Verse 17, there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and also Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul. We've had some recent experience with Ziba. Ziba perhaps told the little fib about Mephibosheth, over whom he'd been keeping watch, and things could get ugly with that. So these two guys, probably both of whom have recently wronged King David when he's lost so much of his power, are the first to come meet him. His 15 sons, his 20 servants, and they went over the Jordan before the king. Then a ferry boat went across to carry over the king's household and to do what he thought good. Now Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king when he had crossed the Jordan. Then he said to the king, "Do not let my lord impute iniquity to me, or remember what wrong your servant did on that day, that my lord the king left Jerusalem, that the king should take it to heart. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. Therefore here I am, the first to come today of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my lord the king." And Abishai, the same one who said, "Let me just take off his head," the sons of Zeruiah, who was it who said that? Was it Andrea? The sons of Zeruiah, it's not just Joab, but it's also Asahel and Abishai. Their answer to everything is what? Violence, and in particular, the bloodiest violence you can get. That's going to solve everything. They're always sure. He said, "Let me cut off his head. There'll be a lot of blood, but that'll solve everything. Things will be just fine." We've done this 1,000 times. So, Abishai, once again in this setting, the son of Zeruiah, the brother of Joab, answered and said, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed." He always knows the answer. Cut off his head. Let there be plenty of blood. That'll be fine. And David said, "What have I to do with you, you sons," plural, "of Zeruiah?" I think that's a shot not just at Abishai, but also at Joab. Why are you guys always creating so many problems for me, or at least trying to? "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be adversaries to me today? Shall any man be put to death today in Israel? For do I not know today that I am king over Israel?" You think I'm worried about my ego at this point after what it is I've been through? Verse 23, "Therefore the king said to Shimei, 'You shall not die.' And the king swore to him." I think we're seeing a new David returning to an earlier David, but even maybe a more mature David than there's ever been before. I think you could make the case, Joe, that maybe he's so upset about his son's eternity more than anything. And in this case, a guy who, by the way, he's probably at this point committed an offense that's worthy of capital punishment under the kingship. You know, it's understandable. But he says, no, he's not going to be put to death. In fact, he's not going to suffer at all for what he's done. Why would this guy not suffer for his errors against the king, especially if he's committed a capital offense? I know what David says here, but I think he's returned to being the man after God's own heart. Whenever we, his children, have so greatly wronged and embarrassed ourselves, and we deserve not just a temporary, capital punishment, but an eternal the second death as punishment, what does he promise to his children? When we humbly, with our tail between our legs also, we swallow some humble pie, well, what does he promise to do every time? Yeah, it could be. And it may be once again that he has a heart a little more geared toward mercy after what God's done for him. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And of course, the parable of the unforgiving servant, after God's done so much for us, what does he expect out of us in return? But to extend to others what he's done for us. And so, yeah, I think so, Joe. You're probably right in that case. He's reflecting the very Spirit of God when his children who have done such egregious wrongs come to him in humble penitence. He's always willing to forgive them. And the king extends this same blessing to this poor sinner. Verse 24, "Now Mephibosheth, the son of Saul," it's been a while since we talked about Mephibosheth, "the son of Saul came down to meet the king." This is the third one. "He had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace." Does it sound like he's really been enjoying life the last several months? Probably not. And by the way, there could be some explanation for this. Who just hightailed it out and left him on his own? But the guy who's supposed to be helping him out in Ziba, and it seems that he probably tricked him into that. He has no one to care for him, and of course he's lame, we know, in his feet. But as he's going to express, it's because he's been in such sorrow because he's been away from the king whom he loves so dearly. Verse 25, so it was when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king that the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? I thought you were on my side. Does anybody recall, and again, I know this is just a little ways back, does anyone remember, though, what Ziba told David about Mephibosheth? Obviously, is that he didn't want to come along, but what else? He said whenever he heard that David had abdicated the throne, what? Very good. He said, now it's going to be, the kingship will rightly be restored to my family. We have no indication of that. The last we know, and Mephibosheth was told that Ziba was going to saddle a couple of donkeys, and he takes the donkeys and he leaves Mephibosheth behind, and he tells what seems to be a complete fabrication to the king about Mephibosheth. So he answered and said, O king, my servant deceived me. That's why I didn't come with you. He said, I will saddle a donkey for myself that I may ride on it and go to the king, because your servant's lame. That's the only way I could get to you, and I had to wait on you. But he left me high and dry. And then he slandered your servant to my lord the king, trying to gain a standing for himself. But my lord the king, he says, is like the angel of God. What do you think Mephibosheth means like about that? My lord the king is like the angel of God. That's a particular entity in the Old Testament. But go ahead. Okay, good. And it might have to do also with his discernment. He may be saying, you're wise like God, and you've heard two sides, and I trust you to sort through the lies and to find the truth. I believe that about you. Therefore, he says, do what's good in your eyes, the chosen one, as Paul says, of the Lord. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right do I have to still cry out any more to the king? So the king said to him, why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said, you and Ziba divide the land, 50-50, and that's the way it's going to work. Now, this is going back a few chapters. This was back in chapter 16. I know we're incorporating quite a bit from the past, but we need to for it to make sense. So, originally, Mephibosheth had all this land of Saul and his family given to him. What happened whenever the report comes from Ziba to the king that Mephibosheth wants to take over the kingship for himself? What does the king say about the land that belonged to Mephibosheth? Okay. Now back there, it's 100% of it is now in your control. He has no land left. Okay. So now, you're right, Emily, when we read, you and Ziba divide the land 50-50, that's different than what's taking place in chapter 16. Now you tell me, these two guys are saying things that are completely opposite of one another. Who's speaking the truth? I want to lean toward Mephibosheth, do you? But, and it's funny because we talked about this, didn't we, on Sunday, and it's strange that Wednesday's come to this point too. You don't really have any witnesses to it, do you? You have one guy saying this, and you have another guy saying another thing. And I think that's probably why the king just splits it down the line. He says, now you guys both have plenty. I don't know who's telling me the truth, I believe is what he's probably saying by that, but that's what I'm doing, and we're moving on. We got bigger fish to fry than that. Verse 30. Oh, can't do this one. Who wants to say our memory verse for tonight? All right. Now, if this is genuine, and I mean, it would kind of seem to be that way, wouldn't it? We might lean in the direction of Mephibosheth. But it's great to hear, though, and how true that is, and we've had conversations about that. A lot of times we think things are important in this life until we lose such close relationships with people that we have over things. And then so often we realize the things really don't matter compared to the relationships. And that's what Mephibosheth, I think, is saying here. Hey, I've got my relationship with you, and that's all I need. I don't care about any of those other things. It's a touching thing to hear. Verse 31, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, came down from Rajalim. You look up at the map, and that's just due north of Mahanaim. And we've moved and we shifted scenes down here to Gilgal, though, just north of the Dead Sea and on the west side of the Jordan River. So he makes a pretty good trip from the northeast down to the southwest. And he goes across the Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. And he had provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Mahanaim. We read about that earlier. For he was a very rich man. He didn't have to use his riches for that reason, but he chose to. Good guy. And the king said to Barzillai, "Come across with me, and I will provide for you while you are with me in Jerusalem. You can live among the king's family and like a king yourself." But Barzillai said to the king, "How long do I have to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I'm 80 years old today. Can I discern between the good and the bad?" Probably saying my mind isn't quite as sharp as it once was. Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? The senses get dulled over time. You don't enjoy food and drink as much. Can I hear any longer the voice of singing men and singing women? My hearing's not sharp like it once was. Why then should your servant be a further burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way across the Jordan with the king, and why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant turn back again, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham, who appears to be a child of his, probably a son, a descendant anyway. Let him cross over with my lord the king. He'll have a good life and a lot of years still to enjoy it, if you wouldn't mind, and do for him what seems good to you in my place. And the king answered, Kimham shall cross over with you, and I will do for him what seems good to you. Now, whatever you request of me, I'll do for you. Then all the people went over the Jordan, and when the king had crossed over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own place. And it sounds like everything's hunky-dory, and we're on the path to reunion once again. No more discord in the country. Well, that's the way it should have been. But there are always some that are going to stir up things, and that happens here. Verse 40, now the king went on to Gilgal, just across the Jordan River on the west side, north of the Dead Sea. And all the people of Judah escorted the king, and also half the people of Israel. Now, let's not forget, the people of Judah were the ones that were involved in the rebellion. And the commander of the rebels, Amasa, once he crosses over and becomes David's commander, he brings the people of Judah with him, and they start this reuniting process. They give this great honor to the king, which you would think this is great. The enemies are even on his side. Verse 41, just then, all the men of Israel, okay, and basically it's everyone but Judah with one exception. Judah and one other tribe is often linked together with them. Benjamin, okay? But the men of Israel, all of them, came to the king and they said to him, why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stolen you away? Now this is the regular usage of stole here. But stolen you away and brought the king, his household, and all David's men with him across the Jordan. You've taken our king. Wasn't this a great thing that the enemies are accepting him as king? But those who accepted him anyway are upset about that. Some will always be upset about something. So all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is a close relative of ours. Why are you angry over this matter? Close relative. From where does David come? What's his hometown? Very good. Bethlehem. Bethlehem of Judah. Joe and Paul, that also has an interesting background. It's of Judah and then gets crossed over to Ephraim, kind of like the west and the east, and more allotment. But there's a background story to that also. But what they're saying is we quite literally are brethren of one another. We're very close relatives. Why are you angry? Have we ever eaten at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? They're asking, what economic benefit have we gotten out of this? We're not getting paid for our efforts. We have volunteered our services. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 shares in the king. What do they mean by that? We have 10 shares in the king. The men of Israel, all the tribes but Judah, and we often forget about Benjamin. And later is going to be a part of that southern kingdom. There's always been this geographical divide in Israel, and it continues all the way until the kingdom divides for good. We have 10 shares in the king, to your 2, 5 to 1. Therefore, we also have more right to David than you, grown-ups, right? We've seen this before. Why then do you despise us? Were we not the first to advise bringing back our king? You guys were late getting on board. Instead of just being glad that they're on board and they don't have to fight each other in another war. We did it first. Yet the words of the men of Judah, believe it or not, were even fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. Often we don't think a whole lot about our words. It's not a big deal, and especially, grown men. It's just guys bickering with each other. No. The whole chapter of James 3 warns us, be careful about your words and the division that it can cause and the fires that can be set. And then we're told this in verse 16. When moved by our words that aren't well thought out, by envy and selfish ambition, even when you would never expect it, among the best you would think of God's people, you will find, instead of unity, disorder. And instead of righteous deeds, you will find every evil practice, things you never thought you would ever, today we would say, see Christians of all people doing. Keep that in mind for as we go into our study next week. Please read for it chapter 20. And this is so strange. We usually have a great 2 or 3 verses. I don't feel like there's just a tremendous one from memory, but I'm going to assign one, of course. Verse 2, if you will, please memorize that one. 2 Samuel 22, and read that passage. That's what we'll discuss next week. But please, I invite any comments you had. I know we had a lot of text, 43 verses to cover tonight, but woohoo, we did it. Any closing comments? Okay, all right, thank you.